Our first speaker this morning is Miss Alyssa Rosemartin. She's with the USA National Phenology Network at the University of Arizona, and her title is Shifting Seasons, Understanding Plant Response to Climate Change. And so with that, I'll turn it over. Did they take my sack? I had one sack left, did I not?
No worries. Oh, good morning. Thank you, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, and I don't know, just really feeling the sense of community, right? Like people are worrying about whether everyone's fed and where they are, and I think that sense of belonging is so powerful and important, and I'm so grateful to April for putting this together. So yes, I'm Alyssa Rosemartin. As the season has been shifting into spring, I've been thinking about like my own history. I grew up outside of Philadelphia. My parents are German and English, and winter was like, I was outside all the time, right? In fall, summer, spring, like digging under logs and walking through the creek and stuff. But then in winter, I was just inside all the time, and we were in this valley, and so there would be this like cloud cover, and every day would look the same. But now I live in coastal Massachusetts, where the joke is like, if you don't like the weather, wait 10 minutes. And I've been walking outside every day, so you can hit the next slide. And these are just from like the last month or two. And it's just like every day is so different. Like the water's different, the sky is different, the plants and animals are different. And it's really like changed my perspective. And this is the first year that I'm like sorry to see winter go. I'm like missing it. And so thinking about all these changes that are happening around us and how powerful it is to bear witness, like what that watching does to us, like how it transforms us to be present and bear witness to the world. And that, if you think about just the next slide, part of that that's focused on plant and animal life cycle events, that's phenology. So even if like the word is unfamiliar, although it's come up a bunch already, because obviously people here are thinking about it. So phenology, the definition is the study of plant and animal life cycle events and how they're responding to weather and climate. So it's observing that part of nature that has to do with plant and animal life cycle events. Next slide. So I want to just ask you to real quick think of one of your favorite life cycles to track and just like tell your neighbor. It'll just take like 30 seconds to think of one and tell your neighbor, maybe someone you haven't talked to yet if they're nearby, what's one life cycle event that you love to see? All right, so I'll bring you this, and 3 hours later. So yeah, I think hopefully those were good stories, and there are definitely ways that we're all connecting to each other and to the land. I'll do the next slide. So the pull it back together. So there's two organizations that I'm going to talk about. One is the Indigenous Phenology Network, which is Kalani, who spoke yesterday, is very involved in that and has led us and mentored us over the years. And this is a grassroots group where we're all kind of coming from different organizations and meeting together, but we all care about phenology, and so we're all meeting together to talk and try to acknowledge the history, think about what it means to do equitable engagement, think about who's benefiting from any particular effort or conference or publication. And just really focus on nurturing those relationships that really make good work possible. So next slide. What I wanted to mention too about the Indigenous Phenology Network, that's open. We have monthly calls, and if you want to sign up for that, I guess I should have put that on the slide, but you can grab my card, and it's easy to join and meet in those Zoom, and then we also connect through Rising Voices. So sorry, can you back up one slide? So then the USA National Phenology Network is an effort federally funded based at the University of Arizona, where it's like my day job, collecting, storing, and sharing data on plant and animal life cycle events, with the idea that we'll use that information to support decision making, to advance science, to communicate and connect with different audiences, and to also build an equitable and just network of people working on this. And we recognize that there's not just one way to understand or study phenology. Next slide. So I'm going to share a bit about what we know so far from a Western science point of view on changing phenology, and then talk a little bit about what we might expect in terms of climate projections for climate factors that are relevant to animal life cycle events, and then talk about our Nature's Notebook program that you can use to collect data. So the big picture that we know so far is that temperatures warming, rain and snow patterns are changing, and this has consequences for plants, animals, and people. And this is from a recent United Nations Environment Report, and so they looked at, every dot on this slide is a study that looked at changes in spring phenology in different groups, and so the midline means like no change, the plants and animals are doing things at the same time that they always have. And dots after on the right are later, and dots on the left are earlier. So we're seeing, which we've already heard a bunch about, we're seeing shifts to earlier timing for many plants, flowering, leaf unfolding, in insects, ungulates, and fish. Birds is the only exception where we're seeing some delayed breeding and egg laying in birds. And then together with this, we also have the recent latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which shows that of like 4,000 species that they studied globally, 2/3 of those are advancing their spring phenology. So like the big picture is that we're seeing advancing spring phenology. And I know I've heard Robin say it before, but I heard her say it yesterday, like looking to what the plants are doing as like our teachers, you know, and so like what we're seeing plants doing is shifting, is moving their seasonal timing. And there's probably a lot more to investigate there about whether those changes are adaptive or maladaptive. You know, are those changes working for those species or not? That's not something that we have ready answers for on the Western science side. Next slide. So a couple examples that might be interesting or relevant here. In the milkweed is advancing 7 days. This study showed 7 days earlier per degree of Fahrenheit of warming. And that study was done more in the like Northeast and Upper Midwest. And then the second study looked at 82 species in the aster family, showing spring coming 4 days earlier per degree Fahrenheit. And this is a pattern that we see a lot where the changes are more pronounced. The further north you go, the more dramatic the changes are. So like as Alaska is seeing some of the most dramatic advances in plant phenology compared to like the southern coastal plains or Florida. Next slide. But so the story's not always so completely simple, right? This is an experimental warming study. And again, the midline means no change, earlier on the left, later on the right. So most species are getting earlier. The dark bars are like they were exposed to more warming, higher warming, and the light bars, they were exposed to less warming. So you see like with rough blazing star, it was actually warming actually made its phenology later. So the yellow ones are the exceptions. And then the roundhead bush clover was earlier in greater warming, but in low warming scenarios, it was a bit later. So there's sort of, you know, at the big, when you like zoom all the way out to the IPCC big scale, yes, most things are coming earlier, but it's not like a completely simple story. And especially if you look at fall phenology, which is less studied, and there's even more nuance and difference across species. Next slide. So then this is moving to projections. Michelle showed us some similar projections here with that caveat, you know, take this with a grain of salt. This is like what we imagine could happen based on what we know about what huckleberry needs in terms of habitat and what it does in terms of its flowering and fruiting. So the first panel on the left is basically shows it expected to move north by the end of the century. So the purple is where it would be going, showing up new, and the red is where it would be less suitable, so disappearing. And then the right two panels are advance in flowering and advance in fruiting, and you can see it's like about 20 to 30 days earlier in both flowering and fruiting, end of the century, what's projected if based on the climate models. Next slide. So I'm going to dig in, just give you like a brief preview of the climate modeling that is behind that kind of huckleberry study, because I think it's relevant. It helps us think about what we might expect, what we might want to plant, what we might in restoration projects, or what we might want to be thinking about as plants go through the next century with us. And I think doing these climate projections takes imagination, compassion, and analysis. Like we have to kind of bring all of that to the table when we're thinking about this. And you'll have a chance to dig in Adrian's Climate Projections World Cafe in a little bit. And all of the projections that I'm going to show are from her project, the projections from the Climate Projections Evaluation Project that was funded by the South Central CASC. Next slide. Sure. I like that better.
So have you collaborated with other people that are doing the same type of work? So Tabitha Graves from USGS is up doing the same thing on Huckleberry Phenology, partially on our reservation and partially in Glacier National Park.
Yeah, so that study I showed was Janet Hervé, and I think that she and Tabitha are working together. I know about that effort, and we had I don't think we ever did get the data integrated, but there was discussions of getting that data integrated. That's great to know.
You still got to tell me where the best patches are.
Isn't that the whole point, that we're not sharing that information? Okay, so like part of the imagination part of this is thinking about how humans are going to act over the next century, right? We don't know. And so what the people who do this climate modeling have figured out as a strategy is to imagine different scenarios. Like imagine if we just basically never stop emitting carbon. That's the high scenario. And imagine that we peak in like 2030, that's like the blue scenario, and then go down. What if we cut emissions right away? That's the green scenario. So on the left, it's how much carbon we think we might emit. Well, the black is what has already happened, and the colors are what might happen. And then on the right is like what temperature increases we're going to be coping with in each of those scenarios. So it kind of helps us picture that kind of, it gives us language and like a framework for that not knowing how we're going to act as a species. And then another kind of uncertainty rolls into this in terms of the science, like the modelers who are creating these climate models. They have different approaches to capturing like the physics in the atmosphere, and so because we don't know which one, none of them is perfect. Some of them are better at some things, some are better at others. So the projections I'm showing are the average across like 20 or 30 of those different models. So there's like kind of two kinds of unknowing that we've got going on here. Next slide. So on this next set of slides I'm going to show you, on the left is the green, and on the right is the red. So it's like the best case scenario and the worst case scenario. And right now the thought is that like geopolitically we're headed between those two. Like we're not going to be as high as the highest, we're not going to be as low as the lowest. So you can think of the future as landing in this region in terms of annual average high temperature between 2.6 and 5.2 degrees Fahrenheit of warming. Next slide. And by the mid-century, so 2036 to 2065. And so these downscaled projections that actually Mike introduced yesterday too help us take those big models for the whole world and understand what they might look like in our region. And so you can see warming is not evenly distributed. It's further north is warming more than further south. Yeah, I think I've said everything I want to say about that. Next slide. And so then we might want to, so now you can see this is now annual average day of first leaf, also for mid-century. Like it's all well and good to know what the annual average high temperature is projected to be, but that's probably not what plants are going to respond to. You know, they don't like wait for the whole year to be over and check what the high temperatures were. They are responding to, so like spring leaf out is responding to what happened in like just January, February, like was it warming up? Were there big warm spells? Was it wet? Was it dry? And so this day of first leaf only uses temperature data as an input, but it predicts like an early spring. It's based on a lilac and honeysuckle shrub leaf out, and that seems to happen at the same time that like deciduous trees are starting to flower. So you might see some of the kind of early spring events between 5 and 11 days earlier by mid-century in this part of the world, and depending on where you are, and even earlier as you go west into New Mexico.
Plants have a cycle, of how they bloom, how they flower and stuff like that, and back in New Mexico where we're at, I know that plants are getting confused with this weather that we're in, And along that, they're thinking that it's going to get warmer, so I think let's start doing it.
Yes.
And then here, just 2 days ago back home, it's snowed again. We were just talking about it. Man, our fruit trees were already blooming. Man, now the freeze is going to come in again.
Yes.
And stuff like that. So it is confusing plants too,
Yes.
In the cycle with this climate change, it has a lot of confusion. And plants are the main thing that taught us everything that we know about. We're noticing all that happening. So
Yeah, totally.
It's good to see this though, and so we're teaching a lot of our people, with our traditional calendars on how we should connect things better in mind, to really connecting with the reasons why we do what we do. And I said that's the only way to connect back to our spirits and to God. And if all Earth people can join in together, we could be the ones to make the change, and that's mainly what we're teaching now. So.
Yeah, I think that's like all I have to say now. It's my conclusion. And it's so great that you brought that up too, because I didn't include those slides, but Adrienne also has false spring risks. So she looks at the freeze and where parts of the country where that is expected, that false spring, what you're talking about, gets called false spring, is some places it's expected to increase and some places it's expected to decrease, actually, with climate change. That really varies across the country. Okay, next slide. So rain also makes a big difference. And so here I'm just showing winter up top and spring down below. Same thing, mid-century, like low emissions on the right, low emissions on the left, high emissions on the right. And rainfall, did I mention this before? Temperature is much easier or more certain when we make those projections of temperature, and rainfall we're less certain. And so just also take these with a grain of salt. But you see some interesting patterns like drying, especially in the winter in the higher scenario. But actually, if you look at that region I've highlighted, that southeast corner of New Mexico is expected to actually get wetter under lower emissions. So it's not like a simple story. And then spring, we're also seeing like heavy drying in New Mexico. So those spring rains really make a difference for germination for a lot of plants. So and these are like, I'm showing temperature and rainfall separately, which is again, like not how plants are thinking about it. They're going to be responding to them in an integrated way. But this is kind of the beginning of the pieces of information that we have to bring to the table to start picturing what these futures are going to look like and how we might best be acting. Next slide. So, yeah, that's basically what it's like, helping us think about these different futures, thinking about how we will all adapt, and then what changes do we want to study. So I'll come back to like observing, bearing witness. Next slide. This program, Nature's Notebook, is run by my organization, the National Phenology Network. And so there's observers all over the country in their backyards and parks, collecting data on the timing of plant and animal life cycle events following like Western science standardized protocols. And sometimes they're answering, like sometimes they've all joined up together to answer a question about like redbud bloom, or sometimes they're asking like an individual question that they're curious about in their backyard. And I'm one of the stewards of this data set. So next slide. So we've been thinking a lot about the FAIR and CARE framework that Scott Ketchum brought up yesterday. The findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. We've been doing that for years in terms of like metadata and making sure the data is well structured and out there. And then for the last just like maybe 3 or 4 years, we've been thinking much more deeply about collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And so just to, next slide, show you what that looks like in practice. It's about like deferring to tribal partners on what data is appropriate to share and what data isn't, like focusing on who's benefiting from any particular project, and then just like really good communication and transparency. Like if I know that I can't protect data, then you shouldn't give it to me, and just being really clear and upfront about that has been what we figured out so far, as well as reciprocity and just maintaining relationships. Next slide. And so it just really depends on the context. Like there's no like one answer for like how we should act in terms of data management in collaborating with Indigenous communities. So like working with Rob and Robin and Melanie and others at Glyphwick, they're studying culturally important plants in the ceded territories, but the locations of the plants are sensitive, and we could like technologically protect the data, but then we realized because of the federal funding, looks like we would be subject to Freedom of Information Act requests for the data, and so it just doesn't make sense for us to hold that data. So they found that the protocols like would work for them, but not the data management. So that's how it's like working well with this partner. And then the Phenology Learning Path at College of Menominee Nation is this amazing trail with like language revitalization and signage, and like they're trying to engage lots of different people in observing the plants on the trail with our mobile app. And so they do use, and the locations, the information is not sensitive, and so they do use our program to manage the data. Next slide. And then Time to Restore is a new project funded by the South Central CASC, where we're working with Indigenous and non-Indigenous partners across those states in the region, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, to better understand when plants that are important to pollinators are going to bloom and when they're going to go to seed, to help know like which plants to plant and where to plant them, and thinking about like how the changes that we're going to see in climate, how those should impact our decisions in terms of restoration today. And so that project's just getting off the ground now. We've had a bunch of workshops with the partners to better understand what the needs are and what the interests are and how we should manage the data for this project. And then now there'll be a phase of like collecting. The partners will be collecting data on plants important to mostly forbs that are important to pollinators across the region. And then we'll be like synthesizing that and trying to predict how those are going to respond to climate. And so the protocols work like this. This is like, if you think, I'm like in my backyard in coastal Massachusetts, observing a single milkweed plant. Every time I go out, I look for leaves, flowers, open flowers, fruits, and then there's like a definition to go with each of those. So if I'm looking for leaves, I see one or more live, fully unfolded leaves, and then I'm saying yes to leaves. Next slide. And I can submit that either on this online interface or on a mobile app. Next slide. And then I can like get together with everyone else who's been studying this and look on our visualization tool to see, here you're seeing in green the leaf out of the milkweed. So that's like the longest, biggest curve. This is the proportion of people who said yes to that particular phenophase or life cycle stage on each day in 2020. And then the purple is the flowering. So you can see like flowering really like hits a peak in the beginning of June. And the monarchs are in orange. So the monarchs actually do seem to arrive and peak a little bit before the purple bloom, but then for the rest of the year, they're aligned. And so we would think there was nectar was available from this plant. So like being able to look at both the plant and the animal together and being able to like amass data collected by different people in different locations gives us the power to explore these kinds of questions. Next slide. So basically, it's getting warmer. Rainfall patterns are changing. Many, but not all, plants and animals are shifting their spring activity earlier, and we have this really important opportunity to imagine the future, to bear witness, and to track what's happening in many different forms and formats. I think the next slide is just a pitch for these World Cafes. Can you hit the next slide, please? The one I'm doing this morning on the Time to Restore project I just mentioned, and Adrian's future climate projections. And that's it. Thank you all so much for your time and the chance to be here.